So they shot one watch out of a device built to mimic a hockey slapshot, ran a 6,000-kilogram truck over another, then froze one solid and boiled a third in a working coffee pot. Every single time, the watch just kept ticking. Somewhere out there are watches that survived worse than anything in your junk drawer. Let's look at 10 of these watches. The one right at the end will surprise you. 10. Timex Ironman. Picture a kid in 1986, wrist deep in a swimming pool during practice, half expecting the watch to die the moment it hit the water. It didn't. It kept beeping through the rest of practice, through the shower afterward, through 6 more years of daily wear, and nobody at Timex ever had to write an apology letter explaining a design flaw. Timex built the Ironman off one blunt idea. A watch that survives sport is a watch that survives everything else life throws at it afterward. No fancy gear train hidden inside. No hand wound spring that needs careful daily attention. Just a quartz crystal buzzing at a steady rate, sealed inside a case that shrugs off chlorine, sweat, and mud without complaint year after year. Here's the part most people get backwards when they think about toughness. The Ironman isn't reliable because it's clever engineering. It's reliable because it's simple engineering. A mechanical watch has dozens of tiny gears meshing together inside a space smaller than a coin, and any single one of them can wear down slowly over the years of use. The Ironman has a battery, a small chip, and a motor turning the hands forward. That's basically the entire mechanism, start to finish. Runners have worn the exact same one for 15 years without a single repair visit to a shop. Not because Timex discovered some secret formula nobody else knows about, because there's almost nothing inside the case that's even capable of failing in the first place. Fewer parts means fewer chances for something small to go wrong, and that basic math doesn't care what year it is or what the watch retails for on a shelf. The detail that gets missed every time this brand comes up. Timex still sells a design barely changed from the 1986 original, decades later, because there was nothing left worth fixing or improving. When something already works this well, leaving it alone is its own quiet kind of engineering decision, even if it looks like laziness from the outside. Think about that compared to almost any other product you own. Phones get replaced every 2 years. Laptops slow down and get swapped out. A cheap sports watch from the 80s is still sitting in production, on shelves, in nearly the same shape because the underlying problem it was solving got solved so completely there was nowhere left to improve without adding cost for no real benefit. That's a strange kind of achievement for a watch most people never think twice about buying. That's the cheap end of the list, built on doing less. Watch what happens when a Swiss company tries to remove the human hand from watchmaking completely. Before we move on to the next part, let me tell you this. Most people don't realize this, but buying a watch the wrong way can cost you thousands, and you won't even notice it until it's too late. That's why I created a complete insider guide to buying watches. The goal is simple. I'll help you stop guessing and start buying smart. You'll find the guide in the pinned comment and description. Now, let's move on to the next part. 9. Swatch System 5.1. In 2013, Swatch built a watch that almost no human being touches during the entire assembly process. Robots put it together from the very first part to the very last. The whole movement, 51 parts total, which is exactly where the name comes from, gets snapped together, lubricated, and sealed inside a single glass case using a precision laser instead of tiny screws. That sounds like a gimmick dressed up to look like innovation. It isn't, and the difference matters more than it first appears. Every human touchpoint in traditional watchmaking is a chance for something small to quietly go wrong later. A speck of dust that lands in exactly the wrong spot during assembly. A drop of oil placed slightly off-center. A screw turned just a fraction too tight by a tired hand near the end of a long shift on the factory floor. Remove the human from that entire equation, and you remove most of the invisible ways. A mechanical watch ages badly without anyone noticing until it's far too late to fix cheaply. The System 5.1 movement is sealed for life from day one. Nobody services it. Nobody oils it. You basically can't open the case at all without permanently breaking the watch in the process, which sounds alarming until you realize that's the entire point of the design philosophy. Nothing gets touched again after assembly, so nothing gets touched wrong again either. Ever. I'll admit something here. This is the one entry on this whole list I went back and forth on longest before deciding it belonged. A sealed movement feels like it's cheating the whole romantic idea of watchmaking. The kind where a skilled person spends hours patiently adjusting tiny gears by hand under a loupe. But cheating or not, the actual failure numbers speak for themselves, and numbers don't much care about romance or tradition. And that's the twist. Almost nobody expects walking in from a $100 Swiss watch sitting on a department store shelf. It might reasonably outlast pieces worth 10 times as much money, simply because there's no tired human being left anywhere in the production chain to make the one small mistake that quietly starts a slow, mechanical decline years down the road. Traditional Swiss watchmaking has always sold itself on the idea of human hands and decades of hard-won skill. Swatch quietly built a case for the opposite approach entirely, at least for the specific problem of long-term reliability. Skill still matters enormously for the watches meant to be admired and passed down. But for a watch meant to simply keep working without complaint, removing the skilled hand from the equation turned out to be the more reliable choice, which is an uncomfortable thing for the industry to admit out loud. Robots solved one kind of failure completely. This next watch solved a different one, the oldest enemy of every battery-powered watch ever built. 8. Citizen EcoDrive. Every battery-powered watch shares one enemy in common: the day the battery finally dies, usually at the single worst possible moment imaginable. Citizen looked at that exact problem back in 1976 and asked a strange question nobody else in the entire industry had seriously bothered asking yet. What if the watch simply ate light instead of batteries? EcoDrive hides a solar cell directly underneath the dial, completely invisible unless someone already knows exactly where to look for it. Any light source recharges it slowly, sunlight streaming through a window, a desk lamp left on overnight. Even the dim glow off a phone screen contributes a small amount. Citizen says some models can keep running for years in total darkness once the internal cell is fully charged, which sounds nearly impossible, until you remember it's simply stored energy, not any kind of magic trick. Owners have reported the exact same watch running for well over a decade without a single battery swap needed. Here's the human piece of this story that matters more than any spec sheet ever could. Somewhere out there is a retired diver who bought an EcoDrive back in the 90s because he was tired of corroded battery contacts quietly ruining perfectly good watches during long trips out at sea. 30 years later, that same exact watch sits on his wrist right now, today. He has never once opened the case back in all that time. The reason this particular watch earns its spot isn't really the clever light trick by itself. It's what that trick quietly removes from the whole equation underneath. No battery means no battery leak slowly eating through delicate internal components. No corroded contacts turning a perfectly fine watch into scrap metal sitting in a drawer. No dead watch waiting on the one single day it actually mattered most. Think about how many small electronics in your own house have died from exactly that kind of slow battery corrosion. A remote control left forgotten in a drawer for 2 years. An old alarm clock nobody bothered unplugging. Citizen essentially solved that entire category of failure for one specific product decades before most people even realized it was a solvable problem worth chasing. Real question for you. Would you rather never charge a watch or never wind one? 7. Marathon Watch Company. Marathon doesn't sell to ordinary people first. It sells to governments. And that single fact changes everything about how the watch gets engineered underneath the case. The company holds actual military supply contracts, providing watches to allied forces around the world under strict, written specifications for decades running. That isn't marketing copy dressed up afterward to sound tougher than it is. That's a government procurement office, writing down exact numbers a watch must survive on paper, then physically testing sample units before anyone signs off on a purchase order worth millions of dollars. Marathon's general-purpose mechanical watch has to keep running through shock, water pressure, and violent temperature swings that would stop most ordinary civilian watches cold within a single season of hard use. Soldiers out in the field don't get the luxury of mailing a broken watch back for warranty service and waiting 3 patient weeks for a replacement. It either works exactly when needed, in the exact moment it matters, or it simply doesn't, and there's no customer service line to call from a remote position overseas. The tritium tubes built directly into the dial, and hands tell the same basic story in miniature form. These are tiny sealed glass capsules that glow steadily on their own, without any battery or flashlight anywhere nearby. No power source that can quietly die at the worst moment. No light switch anyone has to remember to flip in the dark. They simply glow by themselves for roughly 25 straight years, whether a single human being ever glances at the watch or not during that entire stretch. Nobody buying a luxury dress watch off a boutique shelf is thinking about a specification sheet written by a defense procurement office somewhere in a government building. That's the real difference. Quietly hiding underneath two very different price tags sitting side by side. One brand is selling a feeling and a story. Marathon is selling a written contract it can actually be sued over if the watch ever fails to perform as promised. There's an odd kind of comfort in that. A brand telling you its watch is tough is one thing. A brand whose watch has to pass a government inspector's checklist before a single unit ships is answering to someone with far less patience for a pretty story and far more interest in a number that holds up under pressure. Government testing is one kind of proof on paper, official and dry. This next brand decided to invent 130 different ways to prove the exact same point on video, for fun. 6. Victorinox Inox. For their 130th anniversary, Victorinox didn't throw a quiet party with cake and polite speeches. They tried to destroy a single watch 130 separate ways, on camera for the entire world to watch afterward whenever they wanted. They strapped it to a bobsled, hurtling down an icy track at speed. They froze it completely solid inside a block of ice for several hours straight. They boiled it directly inside a working coffee pot on a stovetop. They ran an actual 64-ton military tank directly over it, treads and all. 126 more separate tests followed after that one, ranging from properly serious engineering checks to things that sound almost like a dare passed between engineers on a slow Friday afternoon with nothing better to do. The watch kept running through every single one of those tests without stopping even once. What separates this stunt from an ordinary marketing gimmick is that Victorinox published the complete list of all 130 tests publicly, with results attached. Anyone curious enough can go look up every single test today, one by one, and check the outcome for themselves. That isn't a company hiding behind a vague word like durable and quietly hoping nobody bothers checking the details. That's a company openly daring the entire internet to check its homework and try to find a gap anywhere. And here's the part that actually matters most for anyone deciding what to actually buy with their own money. Most of those 130 tests weren't really about proving the watch specifically could survive a tank. They were about proving a fairly boring engineering point in the most entertaining possible way. That a well-sealed case, paired with a shock-resistant quartz movement and a plainly simple overall design, beats fragile complexity almost every single time it gets tested under pressure. The tank was simply the fun way of saying something an engineer would otherwise explain quietly, with a spreadsheet nobody wants to read. There's something almost refreshing about a company choosing to be this loud about proof, instead of just quietly promising quality on the back of the box. Most brands ask you to trust the word durable printed on packaging. Victorinox handed over the actual video evidence and let people draw their own conclusion, which is a much harder thing to fake convincingly at scale. That's the extreme end of quartz toughness on full public display. Now, let's talk about the automatic watch that convinced an entire generation mechanical watches don't have to be fragile. 5. Seiko 5. Somewhere in a drawer right now sits a Seiko 5 from 1996 that nobody has serviced in almost 30 straight years. It still keeps reasonable time. Owners report this exact scenario so often across watch forums that it has stopped sounding like a happy surprise and started sounding like the baseline expectation for the entire product line. The heart of it is a movement family called the 7S26, later replaced by the closely related 4R36 caliber. Watch collectors affectionately call it a workhorse, and that particular word gets earned through decades of use rather than handed out for free by marketing departments. It isn't the most accurate movement Seiko has ever produced in its long history. Straight out of the box, it might drift 20 or 30 seconds a day, which sounds rough on paper, until you realize that's still perfectly fine for anyone who isn't a professional chronometer judge holding a stopwatch. What it lacks in raw precision, it makes up for entirely by simply refusing to quit under normal everyday conditions. Seiko builds these movements in enormous global volume, using parts that are dead simple to source almost anywhere in the world, and any reasonably competent local watchmaker in nearly any city can fix one without needing special factory training. That's the actual reliability trick hiding in plain sight the whole time. It isn't that the movement never wears out eventually, because everything mechanical eventually does. It's that when it finally does wear down, fixing it costs almost nothing and takes almost no time at all to complete. Compare that directly against an expensive automatic watch built around a proprietary in-house movement that only the original brand is equipped to service properly. When that one breaks down, the owner waits several months and pays several $100s just to get it looked at by an authorized shop. When a Seiko 5 breaks instead, a local watchmaker in almost any city on the planet fixes it before lunchtime, using spare parts sitting in a drawer nearby. This is the part collectors rarely say out loud, because it doesn't sound glamorous in a review. The most reliable watch isn't always the one that never breaks. Sometimes it's simply the one that's cheapest and fastest to bring back to life the moment it does. A watch that fails once every 15 years but gets fixed in an afternoon for almost nothing is, in every practical sense that matters to an actual owner, more reliable than one that fails once every 20 years but takes half a year and a plane ticket to repair properly. Which of these watches have you actually owned yourself? Let's talk about number 4. 4. Shin Spezialtechnik. German pilots and divers needed something very specific from a watch strapped to their wrist. Not something that merely looked tough sitting in a display case. Something that truly wouldn't fog up, freeze solid, or crack apart under real cold at high altitude or deep underwater. Shin built its entire answer around two separate ideas most casual watch buyers have never even heard of before, let alone understood well enough to ask about at a counter. The first is called captive air technology. Shin seals a small measured amount of dried air directly inside the case at the factory, before any outside moisture ever gets the chance to sneak in through microscopic gaps over time. Without trapped moisture inside the case, the crystal simply cannot fog up from sudden temperature changes the way ordinary watches do when moving from cold to warm environments. The second idea is called tegument technology, a hardening process applied directly to the surface of the steel case that resists scratches deep enough to eventually let tiny amounts of grime and moisture slowly creep in over years of hard daily wear. Shin tests some of its models down to -45 degrees Celsius, cold enough to make the lubricants inside a normal watch movement thicken up and seize completely within minutes. Divers and pilots don't get the comfortable luxury of mailing a broken watch back to a repair shop halfway through an actual mission underway. It has to work in the exact freezing moment it's needed most, under conditions almost no other watchmaker in the industry bothers seriously designing around at all. Honestly, I keep coming back to this particular entry because it's the least famous name on the entire list, and it probably deserves to be the most quietly respected of them all. Nobody buys a Shin to show it off casually at a dinner party. People buy one specifically because someone sitting in a lab calculated, in writing, exactly how bad the conditions could realistically get out in the field, then built the watch backward from that harsh number. That's a completely different design philosophy than starting with a beautiful dial and hoping the movement inside holds up under normal use. Shin started with the worst possible day a pilot or diver could realistically face, then worked backward from that nightmare scenario until the watch itself became the answer to a very specific, very unglamorous engineering question nobody else in the industry was asking out loud. Shin solved cold and moisture with quiet, unglamorous German engineering. The next watch on this list had to solve something that sounds almost impossible on paper: surviving actual spaceflight. 3. Casio G-Shock. In the early 80s, Casio designer Kiku Ibe dropped his own personal watch on the ground and watched the crystal shatter into pieces right in front of him. Instead of simply shrugging it off and buying a replacement the next day, he set his small team a target that sounded almost silly said out loud in a meeting: build a watch that survives a 10-meter fall straight onto solid concrete. They built roughly 200 separate prototypes over the following months of trial and error. They threw every single one of them out a window to test the design under real conditions. The 200th design finally survived fully intact after the fall. That watch became the very first G-Shock ever released to the public. Since then, Casio has kept testing the same basic idea in increasingly wild and public ways, because at some point, durability testing quietly turns into its own form of proof that people actually believe. They've dropped watches from serious height, repeatedly, on camera. They've fired one out of a device built specifically to mimic a hockey slapshot, filmed for the entire world to see, precisely because people didn't believe the very first video was genuine, unedited footage. Most memorably of all, inside a Tokyo parking lot, Casio ran an actual 6,000-kilogram decorated truck directly over a G-Shock on video, for anyone on Earth to watch afterward whenever they wanted. The watch kept ticking under every single one of those brutal tests, without a scratch that actually mattered to its function. The engineering trick hiding underneath all that public theater is called a floating movement. The internal guts of the watch sit suspended inside a shock-absorbing shell, instead of being bolted rigidly straight to the outer case, the way most ordinary watches are built. That means any sudden impact spreads outward through the soft shell, instead of slamming directly into the delicate gears sitting underneath. It's the exact same basic idea as a car's crumple zone, just shrunk down small enough to comfortably fit on a human wrist. What makes the whole story land is how public Casio has stayed about it, decade after decade. Most brands would test something like this quietly in a lab and put a small number on a spec sheet nobody reads. Casio filmed a truck driving over one instead, released it, and let the internet argue about whether it was real. That's not an accident. That's a company confident enough in 40 years of engineering to let strangers try to catch them exaggerating. G-Shock survived being run over by a truck on camera for everyone to see. The next watch on this list survived something a truck could never even compare to: actual outer space. 2. Omega Speedmaster. In 1964, NASA needed a reliable chronograph for its astronauts, and, crucially, didn't care in the slightest which watch brand already had the fanciest reputation among wealthy collectors back home. They quietly bought several off-ordinary store shelves in Houston, told nobody at the companies involved beforehand, and ran every single watch through 11 separate tests specifically designed to break them, one after another. The watches faced dry heat up to 93 degrees Celsius, brutal cold down to -18 degrees, a full vacuum chamber simulating space itself, 95% humidity sustained for 10 straight days, and 6 separate 40 G-Shocks fired in 6 completely different directions, one after another. One of the watches tested that year happened to be a Rolex. During the heat portion of testing, its crystal reportedly popped clean off the case under the strain. A Longines Wittnauer failed instead during the extreme temperature swings. Only one single watch out of every brand submitted finished every test, still running correctly inside its stated limits from start to finish: the Omega Speedmaster. In March of 1965, NASA made the result completely official in writing. The Speedmaster became flight qualified for every single manned space mission going forward from that point on. 4 years later, it was strapped tightly to Neil Armstrong's wrist on the actual surface of the moon. In 1970, during the outright terrifying Apollo 13 crisis, astronaut Jack Swigert used his own personal Speedmaster to precisely time a 14-second engine burn that helped bring 3 men safely back home to Earth after their spacecraft had already suffered a life-threatening explosion out in deep space. They weren't simply watching an ordinary product test that quiet afternoon back in Houston. They were watching every casual assumption about which brand should obviously win get proven completely wrong on paper. Inside a real lab, in front of actual witnesses holding clipboards. That isn't brand loyalty talking after the fact, decades later. That's a government document with NASA's own official signature attached directly to it. It's worth sitting with how small the margin actually was. 3 respected watch brands walked into that Houston test facility. Only one walked out qualified. The difference wasn't marketing budget or brand history. It came down to a case shape and a movement regulation choice made years earlier by an engineer who almost certainly never imagined it would end up deciding which watch got worn on the moon. Space itself is one enormous kind of proof, the biggest test imaginable. The final watch on this entire list proves something almost nobody expects walking in, and it costs less than a decent lunch out. 1. Casio F91W. Here's the twist nobody sees coming until the very end. The most reliable watch most ordinary people will ever personally own isn't on this list because it survived a truck crash or a spacecraft launch sequence. It earned its spot for one simple reason: a single number. It might be, quite simply, the single most mass-produced watch in all of recorded human history, outselling nearly every luxury brand on this entire list combined, many times over, without ever once needing to prove that fact with a stunt. Casio has made the F91W continuously since 1989, largely unchanged in almost every meaningful way over that entire stretch, and it's still sitting in active production right now, today, decades later. Millions of them are out there this exact minute, quietly running on wrists in nearly every country on Earth, most of them having never once seen the inside of a repair shop in their entire working life. A basic quartz movement inside, a simple LCD display up top, a battery that lasts for years at a stretch without complaint. Nothing about it looks impressive, written down on a spec sheet. That total absence of impressiveness is the entire point of the design. Reliability, it turns out after everything on this list, was never actually about expensive engineering or exotic materials science dressed up for a marketing brochure. It was always about how few things there are left inside to go wrong, multiplied across how many millions of identical units get built the exact same way, every single time, with almost zero variation between any two of them. A watch built this cheap simply cannot afford expensive failure points hidden anywhere inside its case, so it doesn't have any left over to fail in the first place. Somewhere out there, a kid got an F91W as a birthday gift 20 years ago and still has it sitting in a drawer today, half forgotten, quietly keeping accurate time that nobody has bothered checking in years. That isn't a marketing department's invented story dressed up for a commercial. That's simply what happens naturally when something gets built so plainly simple that there's practically nothing left inside it, capable of breaking down. The most reliable watch on the entire planet was never actually about how much money it cost to buy in the first place. It was about how ruthlessly simple something has to become before there's truly nothing left inside it for time, or bad luck, or a rough afternoon to actually break. That's worth sitting with for a second, because it cuts against nearly everything the watch industry spends its advertising budget trying to convince you of. Complexity gets marketed as craftsmanship. More jewels, more complications, more moving parts, all presented as reasons to pay more. And in plenty of cases, that complexity really is beautiful, worth admiring, worth owning for what it represents. It just isn't the same thing as reliability, and this entire list is proof of exactly where those two ideas quietly split apart. So which one of these watches do you want to own? Let me know in the comments. Like this video and subscribe.